Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar organized by the UCLA Center for Mexican Studies in collaboration with the Latin American Institute and the Institute of Research on Labor and Employment. We want to welcome everyone. We're in for a special treat. We have a very special panel that will talk about a recent book by John Womack titled Labor, Power, and Strategy. And this book was based on a series of interviews and conversations between Peter Olney and Glenn Perusek with John Womack. So before I introduce our panelists today, let me do land acknowledgement. The Center for Mexican Studies at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tonga people. So thank you, everybody, for being with us. We are going to have a conversation between John Womack, who has been at Harvard for a long time, and his official title there was the let me look at my note here. Oh, okay. So he was at Harvard for a long time. He retired, and also we're gonna have Peter Olney, who was the retired director of the for organizing for the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. And also with us, we'll have Toby Higbie, professor of UCLA history and director of the Institute of Research on Labor and Employment. Our conversation will focus around the recent publication of this book, Labor, Power, and Strategy. And I'm going to ask Peter Olney to start the conversation with John Womack. So welcome, everybody, to this webinar. Take it away, Peter.
Thank you so much, Gaspar, and welcome to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with the Mexicanistas in this forum today and discussing this recent book that we put out called Labor, Power, and Strategy. I just want to give you a little bit of background to how this book came to be. I, for many years, was the organizing director at the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. And in that capacity, I witnessed the power that longshore workers exercise in the ports, in the logistics section. You know, there's the potential for total economic disruption on a macro scale of the economy. And there's also always the potential for strategic disruption for the purposes of organizing new workers. So in 2003, I wrote an article in a publication called New Labor Forum, called The Arithmetic of Decline and a Modest Proposal for Renewal. And in that article, I stressed the importance to the labor movement of emphasizing organizing in manufacturing and logistics. And soon after I wrote the article, I got an email from John Womack Jr., professor at Harvard, and I had heard of John because of the book he published in 1969 called Zapata and the Mexican Revolution. So I knew him as a historian of the Mexican Revolution, but he sent me a link to a paper he had written for an academic conference in Helsinki, Finland, called Working Power Over Production, Labor History, Industrial Work, Economics, Sociology, and Strategic Position. And I read this paper, and I was fascinated by it because it really analyzed some of the things that I had witnessed in my capacity at the ILWU, the importance of strategic sectors and the importance of strategic workers. And this paper actually has been published in Mexico as a book called Posición Estratégica y Fuerza Obrera. It's been published in Mexico, but not in the US. So I started a correspondence with John, and I saw in 2009 that the Mexico City government had awarded John the Medalla 1808, which is a prestigious honor that celebrated the bicentennial of Mexican independence and the centennial of the Mexican Revolution. And John passed on that award to the ESME, the Sindicato Mexicano de Electricistas, in support of their struggle after they were locked out by Luz y Fuerza, the public power agency in Mexico City and surrounding states. So I decided this guy not only talks the talk, but he walks the walk. And I decided it was time to interview him and capture some of his perspective on strategic power for labor. So I did the interviews in 2018, and then my co-editor and I, Glenn Perishek, decided that we would draft 10 of labor's best strategic thinkers, educators, and organizers to respond to John Womack and his perspective. And so this is a book of 152 pages, which consists of an interview with John, the responses to John, and then John's responses to the respondents. And I think it's really a relevant book for today's discussion about rebirthing a powerful labor movement. So I just want to acknowledge one thing, Gaspar, that we're not being joined by Joel Ochoa because of health issues. But Joel is a dear friend and comrade, and he, of course, would have added a lot to this discussion. Joel was in the Plaza of the Tres Culturas in Mexico in 1968 when the Mexican government massacred student protesters. And that's a year before John's book, Zapata and the Mexican Revolution, was published. And then Joel in the early 70s emigrated to Southern California and became a leader of CASA, Centro de Acción Social Autónoma, that I'm sure many on this call are familiar with. And he was a leader and combatant in some of the most important and transformational battles in the Latino labor movement in the period from 1986 up until 1994 in the fight against Prop 187. So this discussion would have been greatly enriched by his participation. So we hope he gets well soon, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk with him down the road. So that's the origins of the book, and I thought we could jump right in with my friend John Womack and talk a little more about his perspective and his thinking on these issues. You know, John, you're known as, I knew you as an historian of the Mexican Revolution, but what in that study that you did and research you did in Mexico, how did that lead you to this topic of labor power and strategy?
Well, it was pretty, after the book on Zapata and the Mexican Revolution came out, I decided, I'd already decided I wanted to do a book on Mexican industrial labor. And in the course of one summer in the early 70s, I was doing some research, and they were on Mexico City. And during the revolution, there was a lot of fighting going on elsewhere. In Mexico City in 1916, there were 3 general strikes, and the leader in all these strikes, in terms of actually getting the city, disrupting the city, was the electrical workers. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. There are not very many of them, and this is a big city. How do they do that? And it turned out that while their office was in Mexico City, the power plant that they ran was at a waterfall some 60 miles or so northeast of the city. And there were, I don't know, maybe 100 people that worked there, all told. And so when those people turned off the power, it shut the city down. Mexico City then had no union station, so there was no single train station. There were 6 or 8 train stations around the city. And so to move the freight that came in from different railroads to the railroad where it was supposed to go to its destination, you had to take trolleys, and the trolleys were electric. So shutting down that power plant not only turned off the lights in the city, but it stopped the movement of freight in the city. It and joined then by lots of other workers in the city. These 100 people, and altogether the union of electrical workers was able to throw the whole capital of the country into helplessness. I thought, well, that's really very interesting. And so I started I kept working on Mexican labor and other industries and oil and textiles and so on. But it was this question of strategic position bothered me. And I finally discovered in the work of a guy who was then still active at Harvard, John Dunlop, an economist, pretty conservative guy in the terms of the time. He had himself written about this. So I thought, well, I wonder who else has had this idea since industrialization. And so I started a long review of work in economics, sociology, and on where this idea had sort of migrated and how Dunlop got it. It's not a very common idea. There are certain economists and a few sociologists, more economists and sociologists who caught on to it. But it was Dunlop who first included it in his work on industrial relations. And so that was when I drafted that paper for the conference. And then a few years later, I turned it into a bigger book with footnotes and everything that they published in Mexico. And then happily, you and Glenn were able to get the thing into a sort of a summary in our conversations and in the interviews, and so that's where it came from. I think the main thing was I realized, look, electricity works in Mexico the same way it works elsewhere. Trains run in Mexico the same way they run elsewhere. If this is an industrial question, it's not a national question. That gave me the idea to really pursue this in all the languages that I could manage to read. And so that's how that book came about, and that was the basis of our interview.
Yeah, and we're hoping that now we can get that book that's published in Mexico finally published here. And I think that may be one good product of this collaboration on labor, power, and strategy. I'd like you to dig a little deeper, John, into this issue of strategic position. I know in my experience, we've seen that certainly dock workers occupy a very strategic position in our economy. And then among dock workers, certain jobs like those crane operators who load and unload the ships, they're kind of strategic workers. It requires a certain amount of training and skill to do that job. If they all stand by, nothing moves. Can you talk a little more about both the macro question of strategic position and the micro question?
Yeah. I think, I mean, it's most obvious in transportation and what we call logistics. And there, it's not only dock workers, but railroad workers. If you shut down the railroad yards in Chicago or any big center, you've blocked the movement of freight. But I want to make the argument that manufacturing is also has the same kind of question. Things, some function, one function happens before another. And if you don't do the previous function, you can't do the subsequent function. And so in manufacturing and in services too, in manufacturing, for instance, there was a brewery that I studied, and I wondered how could where was the strategic work in this brewery? And it turned out that, a brewery has, it's pumping ammonia at the time to go to make the cooling system. And ammonia eats up the valves in the pumping system. And so they're continually grinding valves. It was a guy in charge of the tool room who was able to provide people with machinists with the right tools, who had the most strategic position. But in services too, in Boston, the people who can really, the teacher strikes are illegal, but the people who can really bring the Boston public school system to a halt are the bus drivers, and they've done it before. In the schools themselves, the staff people are in hospitals. The staff people are in strategic positions. In the hotel industry, as we call it, it's the janitors. If you leave a hotel without janitors for a day, it becomes unlivable. People won't go there. And so it's not only highly skilled people like the crane operators, but it's the people working in warehouses who Chris Smalls at a conference I was at said he wanted to abolish the word unskilled. He said, any job that you spend more than a day at, you learn some kind of skills at. And so in an Amazon warehouse, there are people who are not by the industrial standards considered skilled, but who can, by not moving the stuff on the moving belts, bring a halt to the rest of the operation. Anywhere there is a technical division of labor, or where in the economy at large, there's an industrial division of labor. In those, what I call seams, in those connections between different technical or industrial operations, that's where the strategic position is.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And you emphasize that in the interviews and in your writings, that it's not a question necessarily of skill or learning or education. It's a question of position. And I think you just articulated that really well. What about automation, John? Some would say, hey, automation comes along. We don't need workers in certain key jobs, so we lose our power over the economy. How do you think about that?
Well, I would say in general that these strategic positions often change because the technology is changing. Some workers figure out a particular connection that they can use, and they use it, and the bosses then to look for some technology to eliminate that connection, but they have to make another connection. And so it is with robots. You get rid of some people, but you then create a new connection. Who maintains the robots? Who, when the robot screws up, who cleans up after it? It's not as simple as the people who sell robots want to make it seem. It seems, well, now the robot will do everything, but it can't do everything. It can't maintain itself, for one thing. And so these strategic positions keep changing. And that's one of the things that I had in mind when I suggested some kind of labor school for understanding this, is because you have to keep following in different industries what this new technology means, and find out in it where it connects with the older technology and where you can break the connection.
Yeah. No, those are great points. And I just recently had a discussion with a young worker at Amazon who's trying to understand how they could put themselves in a position to be one of those robot repair mechanics. And he tells me that there's a whole science now called mechatronics, mechanical electronics, that is basically the discipline that teaches people how to repair robots. So those are very strategic workers, and I hope a lot more young people will become robot repair mechanics who can exercise power at Amazon and other facilities. I just wanted to get your take, John. You know, we have a lot of effervescence now in this country, a lot of excitement because of the organizing at Amazon and at Trader Joe's, and some of these retail outlets, food service companies that are not particularly what we would consider historically, you know, the commanding heights of the economy or the key sectors of the economy. But this stuff is occupying the news, and there's a whole wave of young people, particularly academic workers. We just had a strike in California, 48,000, teaching assistants and graduate research assistants. How do you assess all of that in light of your thesis?
Well, university teaching in the state system is actually a pretty important business because though there are huge budgets for the schools, and if you can shut down the schools, you create all kinds of problems for the school administrators. Among other things, the parents who paid tuition start suing the schools for not providing the services to get their kids graduated. But other services, for instance, well, Amazon is a huge thing. I think there's so far that I've been able to follow it, there's only that one, and there are some others pending, but only that one union, Staten Island, I guess. And they don't yet have a contract. But if you can move in a particular sortation center, and that a major distribution area, that would make a very different kind of impact on Amazon. And if you can put together 2 or 3 major distribution centers, or sortation centers, I mean, at the same time, that would mean a heavy impact on Amazon, and it would, I think, make a big difference. That there are other other cases, for instance, Starbucks, there are, I forget how many, several thousand, I think maybe 9,000 Starbucks in the country, and so far 290 have organized. But the fact is, those are young people mostly, and they're going to go on from that experience to working elsewhere in the rest of their lives. There will, some of them in universities and some of them in other kinds of industrial jobs. And the experience of struggle that they have, even if it doesn't move the economy as a whole, is still very important in that it opens their eyes to the situation that workers are in, and leads them, I think, to question the kind of rules that the bosses apply. So any kind of movement in labor is going to have some repercussions. It'll open people's minds and eyes, and raise then the possibility of movement elsewhere. And so that's what I hope we can help bring about.
Well, my final question, John, goes to a theme that echoes constantly throughout the book, Labor, Power, and Strategy, where several respondents have pushed back and said, well, it's fine to have this kind of structural power, but you got to organize people to exercise it, and you got to have broad political and community support in order to exercise it. Because if you're a worker, say, and a dock worker at a strategic node in the economy, you got a target on your back for the government and the capitalists. So you better have support in the community and in the broader public, or else you're not going to be able to use that awesome power that you have. How do you think about that, John?
Well, you're right, and they were right to bring up that point. Gene Bruskin, I think, in the book, and some touched very well on it. He was writing about Smithfield and the strike there that they had, where the bosses couldn't put the pigs back in the trucks because the workers who were in the livestock department had sat down, and the pigs couldn't get into the slaughtering place. And he made the point that the union to which they belonged had a national network that they could immediately call the labor department, the NLRB, and Smithfield, and start putting pressure on them. I think so. That was crucial for them, and they quickly, in a couple of days, got what they wanted. But I think that the general sort of discussion about what some of the respondents called associational power, public support, is there are all kinds of support that there's political support, legal support, symbolic support, but I think when you but that kind of support is something that anybody can get. The only thing that workers can do is stop working. When you concentrate on these other kinds of supports, sooner or later, it gets to be a kind of, you drift then into looking for political answers and electoral politics. And that's, I think, a very questionable way to go because of the way political parties are structured in this country.
Great. Okay, John, thank you. I think we want to try to get Toby Higbie in on the action here with his comments and reflections. And I see some questions coming up in the chat, which we will certainly, questions and answers that we'll certainly get to, I'm sure.
All right. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, John. Thanks, Gaspar, for bringing us all together. This is it's a great opportunity to talk about social movement and labor movement strategy and the differences to work through all these differences. I would suggest for everyone, this is a fascinating book, Labor, Power, and Strategy. It combines elements of this dialogue that you've just heard between Peter and John, but then a series of 10 responses that some of which will echo some of the things I'm going to say and, and beyond. So it's really a great opportunity to debate constructively how workers can make the most of the power that they do have. Now, as you just heard, John Womack's focus is on the power to disrupt the everyday functions of industry, which he sees as firmly tied to strategic nodes of various productive processes and the workers who spend their days and nights operating and understanding those nodes. Reading this book, as I finished it, I was reminded of the central image of Diego Rivera's mural, Man at the Crossroads of Time, which was originally painted in Rockefeller Center and then destroyed by Rockefeller and then repainted in Mexico City. It's a male worker with his hands on the levers of control, looking out worriedly at the world split between a fascistic past with war and deprivation and a revolutionary future with peace and comradeship. Now, given the limited resources of organized labor and its allies and partisans, the debates in this book, Labor, Power, and Strategy, are vital. Can poor and marginalized workers exercise strategic power as well as high-waged and skilled workers? Are all of capital's strategic points of weakness in the private sector alone? Or should we see public workers, educational workers, healthcare workers as also strategic, or perhaps even more strategic in our post-industrial economy? Is power only in the workplace, or is it also in the diverse associational bonds of community? These debates remind me that strategic power can only be exercised in a collective way. Although the image of the man at the crossroads of time was an individual image, it's a stand-in for the collective of the working class in Rivera's mind. Of course, a well-placed individual can cause a lot of havoc, and when many workers individually withdraw their effective labor, they begin to sap the profitability of their employer and even the economy in general, what the old-time wobblies called sabotage. But these forms of resistance have a diffuse impact and rarely create a timely crisis that can benefit workers as a whole. That happens only when a particular set of people act in concert with a plan and a theory of change. On the other hand, the kind of revolutionary moments that Womack ponders at times in the dialogue during the Mexican and Russian revolutions, for instance, in which organized workers play historically decisive roles, these are exceedingly rare in history. It's tempting to frame the less dramatic events that are more common, like statewide and industry-wide campaigns or even single strikes, as points along the way to these more climatic revolutionary moments. But a more strategic analysis sees that even the most dramatic labor action is in the context of what sociologists call a cycle of contention that will most likely reach a peak of activity and then dissipate. The struggle continues on the backside of that cycle, even as the movement's energy and power wane for a time. When to disengage from direct action and how to preserve the momentum and common purpose between the dramatic peaks of action are strategic and often ignored challenges for social movements. As a result, the challenge for organizations that want to act strategically is to become learning organizations, as John suggested a moment ago. Learning organizations that know how to gather information, to debate and formulate plans, and to communicate strategies in ways that ordinary workers understand. So let me illustrate these ideas with two episodes from labor history that I've researched personally. One is from a period of rising working class action, and one is from a period of disorganization and repression. And apologies to those of you who, this is all going to be US history. So I'm sure we can find examples from other countries as well. So in the World War I era, a revolutionary trade union organization known as the Industrial Workers of the World launched an ambitious organizing drive in North America in the wheat harvest, this massive wheat harvest of central North America, where 100,000 people every summer would flow into the Great Plains and follow the ripening wheat from Texas into Canada. The union's first strategy was to organize workers in the streets of the rural area, the towns of the rural areas where they hired out onto farms. And this sparked a whole series of dramatic conflicts with local officials that gained a lot of publicity for the IWW and landed literally thousands of people in local jails. But it really didn't advance the cause of the union much. Union militants were frustrated, and they debated what was the best way forward in their union halls, where unemployed workers found reading rooms stocked with the latest pamphlets and listened to lectures every night from local organizers and traveling speakers. They shared their ideas in letters to the union's newspaper, and soon they developed a new strategy. They abandoned the noisy free speech fights, as they were called, and quietly shipped out onto the farms where they would then organize workers at the workplace. And once they had signed up enough people on the farm, they would call a quick strike, just as the farmer was trying to harvest or thresh the wheat. And sometimes they won their demands, sometimes they were fired and they had to walk back into town. And there they debated and reported again and wrote more letters to the union's newspaper. And before long, this strategy became a common sense among activists, and strikers became more successful. They started focusing not just on the harvest crews, but on the crews that threshed the wheat, which was a more critical point of the production process. And over time, within the space of a few years, the IWW did something no one thought was possible. They organized a shifting and heterogeneous workforce of migrant outcasts and created a crisis for the capitalist food production system, just as the US economy was mobilizing to enter the war in Europe. Now, some of the folks who make a brief appearance in the dialogue in labor power strategy actually came out of this world. So William Z. Foster had been an IWW and a syndicalist, and the Dunn brothers worked in the wheat harvest, and various other people who went on for long careers. But the Wobbly's success in the World War I era prompted one of the most violent and widespread periods of state repression in US history. Local police and vigilantes came down hard. There were lynchings and mass arrests, and eventually the movement dissipated. But many of the workers who embraced the Wobbly's ethic of struggle continued to read, to listen, to talk to each other. And when the next wave of organizing came in the 1930s, they were there in the Midwestern packing houses, in the warehouses, on the West Coast docks, and in the timber fields, alongside, and sometimes having become communists, or socialists or other types of trade unions. And they made the most of their knowledge to effect unionization when at a more propitious time of the 1930s. Now, my second example, around the same time that the Wobblies were being crushed, a group of trade unionists, working class feminists, and their academic allies built a network of labor colleges across the industrial United States. They were deeply pragmatic in their approach to organizing and education, and in many ways, they're actually non-revolutionary, like consciously non-revolutionary. They were essentially democratic socialists. The labor colleges, though, ultimately nurtured and trained thousands of rank and file leaders. Many of these people were already experienced organizers. Some of them were exiles from their own unions that were going through bitter factional disputes. They were people, again, some of whom appear in your book, John and Peter. Harold Gibbons, who led the Teamsters in St. Louis and developed this idea of total person unionism. Rose Passoda, who organized the General Strike of Garment Workers in 1933 in Los Angeles and rose to national leadership in the ILWU. Sadie Goodman from the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, who helped to found the Western School for Workers, which is the unacknowledged precursor of the University of California labor centers. Now, the labor college movement was another one of these unsung strategic factors in the revival of organized labor in the United States in the 1930s. Alongside more celebrated institutions like the Communist Party's John Reed clubs, these educational venues nurtured worker knowledge and strategic thinking. They also nurtured a network of strategic actors who spoke the same language of organizing, who could recognize each other across divides of industry, gender, race, and ethnicity. Like the old-time Wobblies and other activists of the period, they were already embedded in industry when the next wave of organizing began. Now, as John Womack finishes near the end of his response to his many varied respondents, he asks a question which I guess maybe was rhetorical, but actually isn't rhetorical at all. He asks, is it pie in the sky to propose a U.S. Working People's Institute of Technology for research and teaching on strategic connections of all kinds? I say definitely not. In fact, that's what we're building here at UCLA and Labor Studies, in the Labor Center and our Institute for Research in Labor and Employment, in 6 new labor centers across the University of California, in collaboration with our colleagues in Mexico and other universities across the United States. Our students are mainly first-generation college students from working class and immigrant families, and we aim to help them develop their knowledge and skill through the kind of open and vigorous debate that you've gathered in this unique and compelling volume. And I thank you for bringing me into the conversation.
Thank you.
So maybe, is there any quick reaction, John, before we pass? There are a lot of interesting questions in the Q&A, but I wonder if you have a quick reaction to Toby's comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, those are wonderful, 2 wonderful cases. One I know more about than the other, about the IWW. But about labor colleges, I know there were from the IWW times. There were labor colleges in the most strange places. In the Ozarks, there were labor colleges. When I made that rhetorical proposal question, I guess what I had in mind was some kind of national institute, but that's probably a national place, it would have to be huge. It makes more sense to work the way you people are working in states. And if in every state there could be some kind of movement like this to train people as you are doing, then that would, I think, work better than some kind of national institute. You might still have some kind of national organization, but it gets spread out better when you do it by states.
Thank you, John. So I'm going to invite Peter back, and if you can go over the questions in the Q&A, and if you have any questions, please use that space, and we'll make sure we go over this. Take it away, Peter.
Great. Thank you, Gaspar. And thank you, Toby. That was fascinating. I did not know that wheat harvest story, and that was a wonderful tale. I'm going to drill down on that, and you can probably refer me to the work that you've done.
Will do.
We got some great questions. John, I think we'll start with Karina Rodriguez says, at what point does strategic striking cease to function, especially when we have so many skilled workers that are without jobs? Would they be sought after to replace workers on strike? You want to respond, John?
Oh, we lost.
Yeah, no, I'm back. I'm back. I can see everybody. Start video. Yeah. They don't cease to function. But a lot of times these, as I tried to make the point, these aren't often highly skilled positions. These are, you're not going to get a crane operator to go to work in an Amazon warehouse easily anyway. And what's strategic in one place, a highly skilled person may know how to do it, but it may be at another connection, at another critical point, at another choke point. The jobs may be very different, and so you can't just move people from one position to another. It's the people who are there, who know how the connections work, know how what gets choked when you take hold of a choke point. That's why you learn the most from the workers on the job. It's they who sooner than anybody else knows the effect of what they do once they start to think about it. So I don't think that that strategic positions stop functioning. What happens is that either you win or you lose, but when you lose, that job still has to happen. And so you bide your time, and when the time is ripe, you move again.
Yeah, and I would add also that this again goes to this question that is a constant theme in the book, that without broader community and public support, yes, there can be instances where replacement workers are brought in, but if we have the capacity to mass in front of a facility or facilities with public support, that discourages that kind of scabbing and strike breaking. So again, it's a nuanced discussion of power in the workplace, power in sectors, but also power in a broader society.
Yes. Like the point that Toby made too, that these are collective actions. One person can, screw things up, but it takes all the people intimately around that choke point to make it happen, and you need the collective power beyond it to support them on picket lines and otherwise.
Yeah. So Ruben Hernandez Leon asked John, I missed a few minutes of the webinar. But what about fragmentation in production and distribution, or what some call delocalization, fragmenting production in special economic zones, for example? How does that challenge organizing strategies? And how do we deal with those challenges?
Well, yeah, I see your point, but still, when the fragmentation happens, still, in most cases, I think, it's not every fragment is reproduces the whole complex that existed before. The different fragments have different specialties, and whenever you have specialization in a fragment, one fragment then depends on another. And so you then you find the fragment that affects most other fragments, and you go to work on it. Wherever you can, that's why you need to study the technical divisions of labor. There were economists at one point, Leontief, who had this scheme of input-output analysis for the whole economy. But you can do it also for instance, I saw in research I did on the oil industry in Mexico, within the oil company, one department depends on another department. You can move them apart physically, but still one depends on the other. They're together, close together, only because that makes it simpler. But whenever there is a dependence of one fragment on another, you have the possibility of some fragments mattering more to others than the others matter to each other. And so that's strategic.
Yeah, and I would add that this is an excellent question from Ruben, and some of this delocalization is a great opportunity for us. It creates linkages in that seam that John talks about in his interview. And if we can interrupt those linkages, then we can wield a lot of power. This is not a new phenomena either. If we think about the 1937 Flint sit-down strike in Michigan, this was an auto body plant. Functionally, it was specialized in producing auto bodies, and the nascent UAW interrupted production there and brought the whole production system to a screaming halt. Can you imagine that if we were in solidarity with Taiwanese workers making that chip that was so crucial to auto production? What kind of power and leverage you could exert over auto manufacturers worldwide? So it's both a challenge, but it's a tremendous opportunity if we do what John says and study these production systems and understand how they work. Here's another excellent question from Meiju Louis. You talk about the impact of robotics, which we've seen more of over the last few decades, but now there's AI, artificial intelligence. Where should worker organizers position themselves relating to that new and growing technology? And since these things are so technological, what does it mean for low-income workers who can't get the training?
AI, I'm not sure, again, it's being sold as something that'll revolutionize everything. And I doubt that that will happen. It searches information and reorganizes it into what looks like some kind of original presentation. But that's not it can only search what's there. It can't make anything new. That is, it can assemble it in a new way, but it's not going to produce anything truly original. And it's true. Workers with least skills are not going to be able to manage it. But if they can go into mecha robotics or whatever it was Peter said, then there, for instance, there is something called HVAC, HVAC. If you have a huge lab, the way there are around Boston for the biotech, all of that stuff depends on temperature. And the HVAC people who will be servicing that building have a very strategic position. On all this AI, there's always a question. Nothing works perfectly. I quote some guy says, "If you build it, it can fail. If anything that is constructed can, it needs maintenance. It needs upkeep, and usually those jobs aren't very skilled. There are certain things that clearly in any division of labor, there are certain kinds of people who do one part of the work and another kind of people who do another part of the work. They may change back and forth from time to time, but it still takes usually all kinds of people on any kind of technology to keep it working, particularly to keep it connected with other technologies and working. And it's there that since it's all kinds of people, then people with fewer skills can work and work at it too. And if they find a place where a choke point where they can interrupt the flow of information or the passage of information, then they can go to work on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we've seen some exciting organizing actually among some of these folks who write the algorithms for Amazon. We saw a lot of organizing in the Seattle headquarters, particularly around climate justice and the company's failure to address that issue. We had an organization called Amazon Workers for Climate Justice, which was algorithm writers at corporate headquarters standing up to the company. So I don't think we should forsake organizing these workers also, because they're going to have issues with these mega behemoths. Meju asks a second question, which I think we'll pass over and give a couple other folks a chance and then come back to her question. Dan Ringer Barwick asks, great conversation. I'm wondering whether the interviews raised any insights about one thing. In a context of low union density or lack of contracts, are there strategic or structural ways that unions or other organizers can mitigate the risks that workers face from union busting employers? Strengthening and enforcing labor law would be a great start, but non-governmental angles also. So I don't know if you want to take a crack at that, John?
I'll let you.
Yeah, and maybe Toby and Gaspar want to weigh in also, but I would just say a couple of things. You do acknowledge that labor law reform would be crucial, and I agree with that completely. It's a little bit of a chicken and an egg question, though. Without a strong labor movement, it's hard to push for labor law reform, but without labor law reform, it's hard to strengthen our movement. So that's a dilemma that we face. We do have, even though we have low density, 6% in the private sector, 10% overall, 35% in the public sector, we have labor organizations that have massive amount of resources, money. In fact, it was a calculation was done that if you put all the assets of the labor movement together, that's a pool of $48 billion, which would make the labor movement second only to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in terms of capital assets, and they're very liquid assets also. So part of this is a question of political will, of being willing to spend the money on growth and organizing and getting out of our own sectional exclusivity. This is a challenge for my old union, the ILWU, and get out and organize the broad masses of workers. So it's a political challenge. Again, this associational power, in other words, community and political support, is very crucial to mitigating the risks of the kind of threats that these union busters make on workers. I'll stop there. Maybe Toby and Gaspar want to add something to that.
Sure, yeah, happy to. You know, when you're talking about union density, it made me, it reminded me that, of course, there are certain industries that are extremely dense union-wise. Education, you know, is 90%. Public education is probably more than 90% organized, especially in certain states, certainly in California and other, you know, blue states, as it were. So, you know, I think one of the contributions to the book, Jane McAlevey points out that, you know, the distinction between public and private sector is a little bit of a mystification, because private sector employers and capitalists rely on the public sector for various goods and services, and government spending via tax benefits, but also direct support goes to private sector industries. So just like we recently saw Elon Musk label NPR handles on Twitter to be state-sponsored disinformation outlets, you know, this is just a kind of a labeling question. And that takes me back also to the AI question, because, you know, AI is presented as an apocalyptic technology, much like robots are. But robots have always been presented as an apocalyptic technology. In fact, the term the popularization of the term robot came from a play in which you know, artificial human beings who are set to work in the world's workshops gain consciousness and slaughter all of the humanity. And that was a very popular play in the 1920s and 30s. And a lot of workers actually identified with the robots at first because they thought it was a story of revolution. But AI is a product, and it's a defective product that's being foisted upon us. And I think, you know, just by naming the BS that a lot of new industries, and the high-tech industry in particular, put out, we are able to deflate their power to a certain extent. But to circle back to density, if we were to focus on healthcare, education, and these other so-called public sector areas, not only would there be a good supply of trade union members there, but also they're in certain ways more resistant to robotization and even AI than is some, you know, the supply chain and logistics.
Yeah, great point. John, you want to comment on that before we go to the next question?
Yeah, it reminds me of a point you made that in the auto industry, there's, you know, it looks small, but the UAW has all kinds of possibilities in auto parts plants. So in Detroit, it may look very small. And in Mexico, where they are making new plants, it may look not as small, but But if you then expand it to the whole industry, what goes into a car, and that the parts that it takes, and how that is in fact fragmented. Those, it wouldn't be that hard with the will on the part of existing unions to put funds into organizing parts plants. That could make a big wave of unionization.
Yeah, and it's exciting right now with this new leadership at the United Auto Workers Union, somewhat propelled by this graduate student organizing into the UAW, that now we may see a UAW poised to organize the 1 million unorganized auto workers in the United States. 1 million workers in production and parts that are non-union. And one of the exciting things that's happening is, and Meiju Louis is leading a solidarity network with Mexican workers, that there's now an increased potential for international collaboration in doing just what you said, John, and organizing the auto production supply chain. So let's move to Thomas Ringer Silva's question. What are the sneakiest things that management might do to a budding unionization effort, and how does a group avoid them?
If the unionization movement is working on some kind of strategic connection, if the owners, if the employers can have the money, they will change the technology to remove it or to change it. But it's a question then of how much is it worth? Is it worth it to basically give up and seed some organizing, seed some unionization to the workers, or to try to fight it by one means or another? But you can always assume that the bosses will sooner or later try the sneakiest thing they can find to do. But there are certain things they know about their business, but about how the business actually works in production, I think that is something their workers know more about than they do. And if you ask them and get them to think about it, they can come up with something that will beat the sneakiness of the employer, and at least give it a good try.
Yeah, I mean, the union busting industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry in this country right now, and has been for a long time, relies very much on employing fear and disinformation. Yeah. Fear of an outside party coming in and costing you money and costing potentially you your job. And what's wonderful about some of the respondents to John's essays are that they are the chief practitioners of best practices in organizing, which is you build a sense of confidence among workers, you encourage them to strip away the fear and can openly confront the boss. Those are all the things that you need to do in the organizing process in order to mitigate the effect of these union busters. So for instance, when they hold a captive audience meeting, which is presently their right under the law, though it's being challenged by the new general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board, Jennifer Abruzzo. But when they hold a captive audience meeting, meaning forcing workers to, on company time, to listen to a union buster, if workers are prepared and organized, they shut down that meeting almost immediately by just jumping up and peppering that consultant with questions. Who pays you? The money you're getting could be used to fund a raise for me. We don't need you here telling us about the union. We are the union. So if you have workers prepared and trained and experienced in that, you shut down those union busters. They become ineffective. worker organization makes union busters ineffective. I want to make sure that we get to Meju's second question, given nobody else has thrown one up there. Is it time to start pushing for the 30-hour work week at companies with X number of employees paid for by employers and not taxpayers? Or what might be our legislative agenda, short and long term? I think I'll throw that open to everyone. Toby, Gaspar, John, fire away.
You want me, well, so let me start by saying, I think that, of course, everybody wants to work less and always has. And, especially if you're in an alienating job. One of the 30-hour work week would be great. I think a step before that would be the demand that everyone get paid for every hour or portion of hour that they work, because wage theft is rampant in this society. And one of the ways that it's gotten worse with technology in recent years, especially in the retail industry, is through these complex scheduling software programs that are attached to people's mobile phones. So workers in the retail sector often have to be on call, even though they're not getting paid. Their employer essentially colonizes a portion of their free time, and they have to show up, even if they were planning to do something else, or they could be dock pay or lose their job. Similar things are going on in the railroad industry and other types of industries where employers have come up with novel ways to get around the wage and hour laws. So paying people for every single hour or portion of hour they work, which after all is the central tenet of a so-called free labor system, would be a great start. And then we could move on to the 30-hour work week.
Great.
Yeah, this is a wonderful question, and it kind of links to the topic of this book. If we look at what's going on in France today, where the Macron government is trying to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, what has been the response of the French working class? Well, the French working class is striking, and they're striking often in very strategic positions in the economy, airlines, railroads. And Paris is stinking because of the garbage strike. So fighting for the 30-hour work week may involve exercising power in strategic sectors the way John has suggested. In fact, the origins of May Day, coming up on us soon, was a strike in Chicago for the 8-hour day. So there's a linkage here between these political demands and our power at the point of production and in key sectors of our economy. And as some have pointed out, having strong legislation strengthens our ability to exercise that power. So there's an old dialectic at play here. John, do you have any closing thoughts before we pass it to Gaspar to wrap us up?
Well, I would go back to this question of strategic power and associational power. They're both, it seems to me, crucial. And Toby put it best, maybe, that the place to resolve that difference is in collective action. What happened at the Flint body shop, how you got those people all to decide, and what about the people who didn't want to do it? What did you do with them? How you got most people in that shop committed to holding that tool and die set? That is something that it seems to me goes beyond this question of strategic and associational power. But I would go back to the fact that it's that that stopping work is something only workers can do. The public support, anybody can do. The bosses can get public support. People who aren't involved can give or deprive you of support. But the only thing that is specifically workers is the power to stop working at particular places or in any place. And that is it seems to me, a strictly working class point. So I would, but you need others. You need all the collective support you can get.
Back to you, Gaspar.
Thank you, everyone, for such an engaging conversation. Before everybody logs out, please open the feedback link that we have posted in the chat. We would like to get everybody's feedback who participated in this conversation. We need that feedback so we can continue this type of programming. And also, this is an important conversation, especially for the times we're living. Work is changing. I'm reminded about the increasing number of people who work from home now. And how is this conversation addressing those issues when more and more people are not only, it's interesting that we're mentioning the demand to work 30 hours a week. Well, a lot of these people are working more than 40 hours a week. And having flexible schedule doesn't mean to work less, but also the sense of fragmentation is increasing. And at the core of this discussion is the power of collective action. Labor power means the ability to organize collective action to increase your power at the workplace. And there's no shortcuts for that. And only organized workers can undertake that collective action activity. So thank you so much for this needed conversation.